Alina, always good to see you. I'm just wondering the risk calculation taken by Ukraine going into these talks while also launching this massive drone strike against Moscow, knowing the posturing of this U.S. government thus far, the president publicly stating that Ukraine has been more difficult in these negotiations, and he thinks they will continue to be more difficult than Russia has at this point. It was somewhat of a risk for these drone strikes overnight to be conducted just as these meetings were to begin. Walk us through the rationale you think Ukraine ultimately had in doing that.
Well, certainly what we've seen from the Russian side since the election of President Trump is a huge acceleration in attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, civilians more broadly. And these attacks have become more deadly, and they're hitting territories in Ukraine that are far, far away from the contact lines in the east and the south. And I think Ukrainians have seen that the Russians have ignored the fact that there are negotiations taking place for peace, and they've decided that they will do something similar. And these attacks from the Russian side just simply can't go unanswered when Ukrainian civilians are being murdered across the country, not just in the Donbass and closer to the southeast. So I think this was a calculated risk to really bring home to the Russians that Ukraine will not back down, that they are not going to be seeing themselves as in a weak position or losing the war.
And also, I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, the fact that perhaps Ukraine is sending a subtle, maybe not so subtle message that these strikes weren't conducted with U.S. provided equipment and material, that Ukraine has largely been pretty independent in procuring their own drones over the last 3 years, and also relying on not just the United States for weaponry.
That's exactly right. I think that's such an important point, because there's been an assumption out there that without U.S. support, without U.S. intelligence, which of course are critical to Ukraine's broader war effort, and we've seen what those gaps, especially in intelligence sharing, have already led to, which are some significant growing losses for the Ukrainian side, specifically where the battles are taking place close to Kursk. But yes, Ukraine has been building millions of drones. They've developed their own prototypes. They've developed their own capabilities over time. And these are the most sophisticated, battle-tested, cutting-edge capabilities that are frankly out there. And so they're showing very, very clearly that even without U.S. support, Ukraine will keep on fighting. So any idea that these peace talks are going to be accepted if it's a capitulation of some kind or a complete defeat, that will not be acceptable to Ukraine, and they'll keep on fighting.
What would suggest to you that relations between the U.S. and Ukraine, which fair to say have been rather frayed over the last few weeks, are back on track in terms of the outcome of this meeting? Is it the resumption of intelligence sharing? Is it finalizing a minerals deal? What is it that would give you that assurance that perhaps things have been smoothed over?
Well, certainly all those things you just mentioned. We do want to see the U.S. resume military support for Ukraine, resume intelligence sharing completely and fully as quickly as possible. This is having real effects on the battlefield. But I think beyond that, what I would want to see is an equal approach by the United States, at the very least, to Ukraine and Russia. What we've seen so far is maximum pressure on Ukraine and nothing in terms of what we're asking from the Russians. So I think the Russians are just sitting back and not taking these talks very seriously between the United States and Ukraine. They think the real deal will be made between Putin and Trump at the table, signing off on Ukrainian capitulation. And they see a strategic opportunity to really complete what Putin sees as the unfinished business of the collapse of the Soviet Union, to regain Russian greatness at the negotiating table with the U.S. president. So I think we just have to make no mistake about it. There is no reality in which Ukraine stops fighting, no matter what the deal is. And for the relations to be on a better path, well, we want the United States and Ukraine to be allies and partners, as we've seen for decades, and Russia to be called what it is, which is an adversary and an enemy to the United States and our allies.
And to the point of perhaps a Trump-Putin meeting, a prelude may be what is reported as Steve Witkoff traveling to Moscow for what would be a second, I believe, meeting with Vladimir Putin in just the first 6 weeks of this administration. Obviously, Steve Witkoff, a very close advisor and friend and confidant of Donald Trump's. Technically, he's the Mideast envoy, but he's been heavily involved in these negotiations as well. How much should we read in to these talks if they indeed do happen between Witkoff and Vladimir Putin, and how are Ukrainians viewing it?
Well, certainly it's a very odd situation that the United States is sending in person a key advisor to the U.S. president to go to Moscow to give a readout without Ukraine present, without any of our allies there present, on the conversations that are taking place as we speak in Jeddah and Saudi Arabia. This is unusual is really too soft of a word for it. In a different circumstance, we would see the complete opposite of that. We would see a much more effort to first coordinate it with Ukraine and with our European allies on what the asks and demands will be for some ceasefire or any cessation of fighting with the Russians. And then we would see the U.S. potentially taking the lead, informing the Russians that these are our demands. These are the things we want to see at the negotiating table. I think right now we're seeing the complete reversal of that, where the Russian views, the Russian demands are being given far greater priority, and we're spending a huge amount of effort to make sure the Russians are on board, when this is the country that has launched this war 3 years ago, not Ukraine.
I mean, it's even stunning and worth noting that these talks between the U.S. and Ukraine are happening in Saudi Arabia. Before, I would imagine, in any other administration, they would have happened in Washington again. I mean, we saw the debacle the last time the presidents met in the Oval Office, or even in Kyiv. But the fact that they're happening in a third-party country, again, where the U.S. had always had a stance of being Ukraine's top supporter and ally, is quite stunning and sends a message of its own. How is this all being viewed among European countries?
There's a huge amount of anxiety and panic in Europe right now over how the U.S. is handling these peace talks with Ukraine and Russia. The main concern is that conversations about European security are taking place without Europeans at the table. Europe is still not at the table for any of these bilateral conversations the U.S. is driving forward. The other big concern that the stop in intelligence sharing, I think, really raised panic among European allies who have bought so many American weapon systems that are reliant on U.S. intelligence sharing to be operable. And so now they're asking themselves, you know, we have bought all of these systems from the United States. We're spending all of this money in the U.S., but will there come a time when the U.S. government just says, we're going to shut that down, and all of these, multi-billion-dollar systems you have, from Patriots to F-35s, anything you name, are going to be completely obsolete? Is this the reality that we're living in now, where the U.S. is going to be this completely unreliable ally to Europe? And I think this is the main debate that's taking place probably as we speak in Paris, where we have a meeting of defense ministers from Europe gathering as we speak.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. How serious is this idea of sending European peacekeepers as part of whatever ceasefire plan is ultimately agreed upon to Ukraine physically to patrol the borders there without a U.S. backstop?
Well, it's obvious that if there is a negotiated ceasefire that has a line of contact, the only way to ensure that that line of contact is kept by the Russians is to have an international force to secure that line. We still have 30,000 troops to secure the line between North Korea and South Korea. And I would say that's the main reason we haven't seen a resumption of hostilities on the Korean Peninsula. So clearly, this is the right way forward. These are serious conversations. Europe needs to get a force together. That is without question. The problem, of course, is that Europe cannot have an army overnight. And we know that Europeans have divested for decades from their military capabilities, and that was a mistake. And there's no question about that. So the Europeans need the United States to back them up, because they know that a Polish soldier or French soldier being killed will not actually be a real tripwire for a more massive Russian attack on Europe, unless there is the force of US military behind it. So this is why the Europeans are willing to put in the forces now, and they're getting it together, which is a huge positive. But they're very, very anxious that without the US there in some capacity, it doesn't have to be boots in the ground, it can look in all kinds of different ways, that these forces will not actually serve the deterrent and defense and peacekeeping function that they're designed to do.
What impact is all of this uncertainty from the United States having on the issue of nuclear proliferation by other European countries? We know that France and England are the only nuclear powers in Europe right now. The fact that this is even being discussed in some countries is pretty telling.
Exactly, especially in Germany. This conversation around nuclear deterrence has even taken place in Germany, which is a country that has been completely antithetical to anything having to do with nuclear energy, forget nuclear deterrence and nuclear defense. So I think we're seeing a real sea change take place across Europe now. But I think this issue is so profound because the reason we have had peace and security in Europe, and the reason why we haven't had the proliferation of nuclear weapons across European countries and beyond in a massive way, is because of the US security umbrella and the nuclear umbrella. If that is seen as unreliable, there's gaps in it that our adversaries see themselves as exploiting, I think we're facing a world in which every country in the world will take the message that the US is not a reliable security partner, and they will commit significant resources to develop their own nuclear capabilities, because the Ukrainians will tell you, if they had not given up their nuclear weapons in 1994 in exchange for verbal guarantees from Russia and other allies that they would not invade Ukraine, they do not believe they would be at war with Russia today.
Yeah.
And that is a very, very dangerous message that I think we are currently sending, not just to Europe, but across the world.
Yeah, no doubt. These are conversations not only being had in European capitals, but we know South Korea, Japan as well, having these conversations as they're having to go to Plan B in terms of whether or not the U.S. will be there to defend them ultimately. Alina Polyakova, thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you.